Welcome to Cat Has Questions, curiosity, stories, and the strange corners of everyday life. Hi, and welcome back to Cat Has Questions, episode 2. That means if you're here, you returned on purpose. Wow, love that for us. If you are a family member or a friend, I bullied into hitting play. Also love that for us. Truly a win-win. I'm recording this right around what would have been my dad's 62nd birthday. He passed away in 2019. And so about 6 years ago from non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. He had a battle with cancer for about a year and a half. So in honor of my dad's birthday, I am going to be covering the JonBenét Ramsey case. And you may be wondering how that is connected at all. But me and my dad would watch a lot of documentaries on the JonBenét Ramsey case. I think it was when I was just graduated from college and I was getting my doctorate in audiology. And one of the years I lived at home when I was getting my doctorate. So spent a lot of time watching TV with my dad and my parents. And JonBenét Ramsey, we knew we could solve it. And we watched so many documentaries. And as I was researching for this episode, I realized how many documentaries and different things that came out in 2016. So I'm guessing that is why we got really hooked on it. And every docuseries we watched, we had it solved. And we even joked that we had our own murder solving LLC, that we were like, oh, what's the next case we're going to solve here? You know, with whatever one-sided documentary we saw that day, we knew who had committed the murder. So I am going to tell you this very overtold story. It's a very complicated case, definitely not better than other people, and likely a little bit worse, but here we go nonetheless. My sources for today are from biography.com, an article called JonBenét Ramsey by Catherine Caruso and Meredith Worthen. That'll be the main one. And then I also used an EBSCO piece titled The Ramsey Murder Case by Maureen Puffer Rothenberg, but I will put both of these in the show notes. So, the JonBenét Ramsey case. Honestly, I feel like most people have heard of it, even if only vaguely. It's one of those cases that has lived in the true crime world forever. But if you actually haven't heard it, here's who JonBenét was. She was a 6-year-old child beauty queen who lived in Boulder, Colorado. The day after Christmas in 1996, she was found dead in her family's home. Her murder remains unsolved to this day, and it became one of the biggest and most controversial police investigations of the decade. There are two main theory categories people always go back to: that the family did it, or an intruder got in. Her parents and brother were never charged, and DNA testing in 2008 actually cleared them, at least according to investigators. But the theories really never stopped. So JonBenét's early life. JonBenét Patricia Ramsey was born August 6th, 1990 in Georgia. Her name was literally a combination of her parents' names. JonBenét Ramsey, who was her dad, he was a multimillionaire businessman, and Patricia Patsy Ramsey, her mom, who was a former Miss West Virginia. Very pageant-coded family already. In 1991, the family moved to Boulder, where John's business merged with another company, and they ended up in a big, luxurious home in a really nice neighborhood. JonBenét had an older brother, Burke, who lived at home, but she also had 3 older half-siblings from her dad's first marriage. One of them, Elizabeth, had died tragically in a car accident in 1992. The other 2, Melinda and John Andrew, were older teens or adults at the time, so they did not live in the Boulder home. JonBenét herself was known as outgoing, bubbly, and full of personality. Patsy put her into beauty pageants starting young, and by 6, JonBenét had already won several titles. Little Miss Colorado, National Tiny Miss Beauty, America's Royal. She was good at pageants, a little pageant girly. And if you've ever seen photos of her, she was so cute. Back home, she was in kindergarten at High Peaks Elementary, and the Ramseys truly doted on her. They lived a very comfortable, very affluent lifestyle. They even owned a vacation home in Michigan. And because of that wealth, some people later claimed that JonBenét became a target. So the morning that everything changed, early on the morning of December 26th, 1996, the day after Christmas, Patsy Ramsey called the police after finding a 3-page ransom note demanding $118,000 for JonBenét's safe return. Only 3 people were believed to be in the house at the time: John, Patsy, and 9-year-old Burke. The only sign of a possible break-in was a basement window that was open, but there were no obvious signs of a struggle. So friends, family, and officers all start searching the house. And again, this detail always gets me. There were people walking all over the house because police assumed they were dealing with a kidnapping, not a homicide. They didn't treat it as a sealed scene because they didn't know it was a homicide. Hours later, John Ramsey and a family friend went to the basement, a part of the house that somehow hadn't been searched, and found JonBenét's body in a small room. She had been strangled with a garrote made from a cord and what investigators believed was part of Patsy's paintbrush. She also had a skull fracture, bruising, abrasions, and signs that she had been sexually assaulted. DNA evidence was found, but it was very limited, and her death was ruled a homicide immediately. So there were quite a few mistakes within the investigation. When police arrived, they made several crucial errors. One, they didn't immediately secure the home. Multiple people were walking around contaminating evidence. JonBenét's parents were not separated for questioning. Some reports and evidence were shared back to the Ramseys. And John removed duct tape from her mouth and carried her body upstairs when he initially found her, which understandably destroyed some evidence, but I do not blame him at all. No parent would be thinking straight of like, oh, let me preserve the crime scene when, they're in shock because they just found their dead child. But because of these early missteps, the investigation started on shaky ground. And quickly, the public and a lot of the investigators began looking at the Ramseys themselves. Okay, so this ransom note, people have analyzed the life out of it. So it was written on paper from inside the house, and it was 3 pages long, which is very unusual for a ransom note. Handwriting analysis also could not rule out Patsy as the author, and the amount demanded was $118,000, which matched John's exact year-end bonus. So that was very suspicious. Fibers from the duct tape on JonBenét's matched fibers from Patsy's clothing. So you can see why people were pretty suspicious of them. But the Ramseys remained adamant that they were innocent. They hired private investigators, they offered a reward, and they did media interviews. Although those interviews, especially for Patsy, made people even more suspicious. She had a very pageant, polished vibe that read as cold to the public. Whether that's fair or not, it did hurt them. So then also some other things regarding the interviews and DNA and Burke's role in all of it. The Ramseys weren't formally interviewed until 4 months after JonBenét's death, which was April 1997, which is so wild. They were not interviewed for 4 months about her death. And then they were interviewed again, June 1998. Burke, who was only 9 at the time, was also interviewed. Some theories pointed at him, mostly because there was a bowl of pineapple on the table, and JonBenét had undigested pineapple in her stomach. People have speculated that maybe Burke got angry and struck her when she was trying to eat his pineapple, and that the parents staged the rest of the scene to protect him. But experts said a 9-year-old could not create the garrote or inflict all the injuries. So officially, he was only ever a witness, not a suspect. So some other suspects, other names floated over the years included a sex offender named Gary Olivia, an electrician, Michael Helguth, a pageant photographer, and even the town Santa. Yes, really, the town Santa. But none were charged. With the case stalling, the district attorney convened a grand jury in 1998. The panel actually voted to indict John and Patsy on child abuse, leading to the death and accessory charges. But this is huge. The DA chose not to prosecute, saying there wasn't enough evidence. And the existence of that indictment wasn't made public until 2013. I remember when this detail came out, it kind of reignited everything. In the early 2000s, the Ramseys released a memoir called The Death of Innocence, and they sued a Boulder detective for defamation because he also wrote a book accusing them, and they all settled that lawsuit. And then in 2002, Patsy Ramsey sadly died of ovarian cancer at the age of 49. And then in 2006, so about 4 years later, a man named John Mark Carr, a teacher living in Thailand at the time, confessed to JonBenét's murder. This was international news. Investigators flew him back to the US, and then DNA testing immediately ruled him out. So that ended as quickly as it began. In 2007, new DNA testing concluded the killer was not a blood relative. And in 2008, DA Mary Lacey wrote a formal letter clearing John, Patsy, and Burke, saying no innocent person should endure the level of public scrutiny that they had. The DNA belonged to an unknown male, though some experts later questioned whether the sample might be mixed DNA rather than a single person's. So even the so-called clear-cut DNA evidence isn't totally clean. And then this brings us to 2016. So around the 20th anniversary, Burke appeared on Dr. Phil. This was a huge moment because he had basically never spoken publicly before, and he maintained his family's innocence and said he believed it was a pedophile from the pageant world. That same year, I think it was like a couple weeks later, the CBS documentary, The Case of JonBenét Ramsey, came out and heavily implied that Burke killed her. And I 100% remember when this blew up, everyone online was speculating again. TikTok didn't even exist, but this would have been made for TikTok energy. Burke sued CBS for defamation and settled for an undisclosed amount in 2019. So this case has so many theories. An intruder sneaking in through the basement, a family cover-up, Burke reacting in anger, pageant world predators, someone who knew their schedule or someone who clearly knew John's work bonus, so maybe from work. Or maybe there are multiple people involved, especially if the DNA is mixed, if it is mixed. So people point to DNA, but then argue the DNA might be contaminated. People point to the window, but then they argue there's no debris. People point to the ransom note, but then argue an intruder could have staged it. It's one of the most endless debated true crime cases ever. As of the last major updates, more than 2,500 pieces of evidence exist. Samples from 200 plus people were taken. Over 21,000 tips have come in, and nearly 1,000 DNA samples have been analyzed. In 2023, the case fully became digital. In 2024, a Colorado cold case team reviewed it and gave recommendations that the Boulder PD is still currently reviewing. And in the world of documentaries and dramatizations, there was Casting JonBenét in 2017, The Killing of JonBenét, The Truth Uncovered, Netflix's Cold Case, Who Killed JonBenét Ramsey, which just came out in 2024. And then there's actually a new limited series coming out on Paramount Plus, starring Melissa McCarthy as Patsy Ramsey and Clive Owen as John. So this case is not going anywhere anytime soon. And today, it remains unsolved. Even after decades, thousands of interviews, endless theories, and mountains of evidence, no one fully knows what happened that night. Was it an intruder? Was it an inside job? Was it a tragic accident covered up? Or a crime of opportunity that spiraled? There are clues pointing every direction, but none of them tie neatly together. And that's why this case still grips people almost 30 years later. But that is all I have for episode 2. Stick around. I will have another episode released next week. Thanks for listening to Cat Has Questions. If you liked this episode, follow the show and share it with someone who loves a good spiral. See you next week.